So yeah, hi everyone, I'm Becca. Also, like Rebecca Stormbeaver, my main things are fencing, I do some weaving, I do a lot of research, I do most ANS I can get my hands on at various times. And today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about architecture, and specifically about a quick whistle-stop tour of differences between Romanesque, early English, decorated and perpendicular, with a particular focus on Ely Cathedral. So Romanesque is sort of like late Anglo-Saxon, early Norman style of architecture. You often see it described just as Norman. Its main hallmarks are the rounded arches, often with zigzag decoration, sometimes sort of like spiky versions of decoration, or known as like beakheads, where you have what appears to be like an actual little head with two eyes and a beak that reaches over the side of the arch, and you have a whole row of little kitty holding up the arch. Another major thing you see in Romanesque carving is you see these sort of like extremely stylized faces and extremely stylized swirling foliage. So an example of that kind of thing is the Ely Cathedral prize door, but also you see it on column capitals all over the cathedral. So you see here, you've got this little stylized animal here, and this like kind of bulbous, lumpy plant life. So that then turned fairly quickly after the Norman invasion. You start getting Gothic architecture coming over from the continent. And the real hallmark of all three varieties of Gothic architecture, so you've got the early English, decorated and perpendicular. The main hallmark of that is the pointed arch. So this is where you move over from the rounded arch of the Romanesque period into those classic pointed arches. So again, pulling at random because there are a lot of them. There's the prize store. Never find them when you want them. Cases right there, like this now full of Romanesque arches. So you can kind of see those a little bit here in this facade of the Lady Chapel, also at the top there. Classic pointed arch. And the first ones you start seeing are those with the early English style. You see especially in windows, where you have these very narrow, thin, pointed lancet windows. Sometimes you see collections of them where you wanted a little bit more light, but they're always very narrow. Ones I've seen are often like this wide. Which also means you've got a splay on the inside to try and let a little bit more light in. This makes the whole thing look like an arrow loop. They are not arrow loops, this is just to let in the maximum amount of light. Other features of that period, you're starting to see a little bit more intricate decoration, but mostly it's still that sort of like quite straightforward, stylized decoration. This stopped being the case when we went into the decorated period, which, as the name suggests, they suddenly discovered extremely complicated carving. The other hallmark of this, when you see windows, is you start to see a lot more larger arches, and which gives them a lot more scope for tracery. The decorated period is where tracery really started coming into its own. And you particularly see, it's known as flamboyant tracery. I don't know if the English word flamboyant, meaning sort of colourful and like big, came from the term used for the tracery, or the other way around. A lot of these terms were actually assigned during the 19th century, and things like the term Gothic were not complementary, but it comes from words for flame, and so the shape of the flamboyant tracery was sort of like curvilinear and very sort of like flame-like. You see like this sort of shape happening. The other thing you see is these like very sinuous curves. And the classic arch shape for the decorated period is the OG arch, which comes up and has a sort of like S shape at the top, coming to a point. So, the Ely Cathedral Lady Chapel is a classic example of both decoration and decorated architecture. It is absolutely full of these OG arches. It's particularly full of what's known as nodding OGs, which is where the classic OG is vertical. Nodding OG, the pointed part actually leans forward slightly. The other classic hallmark of decorated is what I sometimes describe as carving that looks like it was done by someone in a fever dream. It's absolutely covered in extremely intricate, massive amounts of foliage. You get, you start getting these things called wallflowers. There's a going theory, these are not in fact flowers, they are bells. But you get a lot of those, you get a lot of sort of figure work. Again, Ely Cathedral Lady Chapel has massive friezes of the life of the Virgin Mary, OG arches, flamboyant tracery, everything you could ever ask for a decorated space. Then the Black Death came, and everyone who knew how to do that died. I exaggerate slightly, but it was actually around that point you start to get the move from the decorated period into the perpendicular period, where the lines became a lot simpler. You didn't have so much of the complicated decoration. You still saw OG arches because once you learn how to make a thing, why stop? But the classic, particularly window design you get during the perpendicular period is, as the name suggests, you get a lot of vertical lines, you get a lot of horizontal lines. So you tend to see a lot more like horizontal divisions within windows. And you also see a lot more like sectioning into sub-arches. So rather than getting that sort of like complicated flamboyant tracery, you use like the smaller Gothic arches within the larger arch. It is worth bearing in mind the tracery in these windows is not load-bearing. The entire load of the wall is borne by the main arch, or all sub-arches are purely decorative. Sometimes you would get decoration that was designed specifically to make some kind of theological or decorative point. The classic example of this is a decorated form called Jesse tree tracery, which came up in a single trunk in the middle with curving branches coming out to the side. And you get these that would show things like hierarchies of angels in heaven and mostly Jesse trees, as the name suggests. This is sort of like line of descent of Jesus. It's like coming down to Jesse, the father of David. So it's perpendicular, it's much simpler lines. The perpendicular period is when you start to see fan vaulting. So you see vaulting up until that period. The very first vaults you see during the Romanesque are barrel vaults, which are again just like those round tunnels that you sometimes see. That moved on into slightly more pointed vaulting during the earlier Gothic period. But it's when you get into perpendicular, you see fan vaulting, you can find that you see famously in King's College Chapel. The other decorative roof feature you start to see during the perpendicular period is pendula, where you actually get things coming down from the vaults and you get stairs dripping down. And then, yeah, after that, things got simpler and a lot more boring. You go into Tudor domestic, where you start to see like flat-top windows, and it's not fun anymore. So, yeah.
Boring. So, you can see examples of just about all of this from Romanesque all the way through to perpendicular at Ely Cathedral?
At Ely, pretty much, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, the best example of decorated, apart from the Lady Chapel, is there are two chantries. So these are from Bishop Alcock's chantry. The really spectacular one is Bishop West's, where it's just absolutely covered in this sort of floriated, flamboyant Michael architecture. Even people who have written articles on Ely Cathedral describe Bishop West's chantry in particular as a little bit much. You kind of get the feeling that when it was being designed, he kept looking at it and going like, I can see a bit of stone that isn't carved into something complicated. Yes, you can see pretty much all of them. I just didn't mark up this book the way I should have done to actually find the examples beforehand. Yep.
May I encourage you to give that as an illustrated talk at Cambridge University online, please?
Sure. When is it?
January?
Okay, I'll look.
I wouldn't be against a field trip.
Excellent. Oh, I like that.